right. Now we are live. And I'm so excited about tonight to have our guests back, Apostle Paula Cole and Dr. Wanda Parker. Um, for those who may or may not have seen the flyer, we are talking about mental health and social injustice. And so I'm just really excited and looking forward to the discussion tonight. And so for those that did not catch, and I just want to do an overview of what the definitions of social injustice is really quickly, and then we're going to dive back into the conversation. So when we think about social justice, it is the fairness as it manifests in society, and that includes healthcare, employment, housing, and applies to all aspects of society as well, which includes race and gender, and it is closely tied to human rights. When we think about injustice, on the other side of that, it is the lack of human rights that are manifested in the daily lives of people in society. So that would include marginalized communities. So the first part of this conversation, we pretty much dove into the topic of mental health and social injustice and the effects on individuals as well as within the church and the body of Christ, and how it affects us in different ways, as well as different leaders and how it has attributed to where leadership are not particularly speaking up on certain topics. And so we're going to, for this part, kind of go into the conversation, and we're going to try to hit on some solutions that we can face. Last time we kind of hit on how we maintain our sanity when we do see things that are going on and injustices that we see. One of the things that I do want to ask more in depth is, how does either seeing social injustices or hearing about social injustices affect us in our minds or spiritually, like how it affects our soul, our mind, our will, our emotions? How does it affect us in those ways? And so either one, this is open to the both of you to answer. So
good evening, Apostle. It's so good to see you.
It's good to see you too. I'm already defaulting to you, so we're not
It's so good to see you. Good evening to my beautiful prophetess Brittany. It's so good to be back here again on part 2. You know, I was listening to I wasn't gonna just say, "Go ahead, Apostle, you can handle it." I said I was gonna just try to do the reverse. I'll start this time. And to all of our listening audience, those of you that have joined us via Facebook Live and streaming here on StreamYard, I was thinking about this and praying about this, and in response to the social injustices, what came to my mind, Brittany, is the concept of social, and I think the key word is concept. The concept of social injustice is different for individuals because we come from different worldviews. And while we have a broad definition of it, as well as seeing the manifestations of it in our emotions, in our spirit, in our soul, I think what could be a social injustice for me may not be a social injustice for somebody else. But if we're going to look at the broader picture of social injustice, inclusive of the marginalized and those individuals who fall victim to being socially abused through the injustices of society, and those who think that they are right because of their privileges, that they could prey on the underprivileged. I think having a clear and concise definition of social injustice for me would better help me to address your question around the effects. Am I hearing your question right? The
Mhm.
effects that it has on the church, the effects that it has on us spiritually, because to me all of those are different. The church spiritually, because the church is the entire congregation, the body of Christ. Spiritual effects, we can't always discern that that particular effect. Let me say I can't. I put it in the I posture. Unless it is spiritually revealed, I can't always discern what a person is experiencing in their soul and in their spirit as it pertains to social injustice that has happened to them. And the principles that are practical, the how to's that help facilitate the voice of the church, I think it's what we are lacking. So your conversation is definitely apropos. Your conversation is so on key and on point. And in response to that, when I read the scripture out of Psalms, why art thou downcast, O my soul? Why art thou disquieted within me? Hope thou in God. The Berean study Bible, I love the Berean study Bible. And the way the Berean study Bible reads it, the Berean Study Bible, I think I got it here in my notes. The Berean Study Bible, I don't, here it goes. It says, why are you downcast, O my soul, and why the unease within you? Downcast and the unease. Those are two emotions that are spiritually discerned and spiritually revealed to those who have a keen insight. And I think sometimes the church can lose sight on what is being experienced through a social injustice. Sometimes the church can lose its voice, because I think the social injustice is bigger than Breonna Taylor. It's bigger than George Floyd. I believe social injustice is a global kind of encounter that people experience all over the world that affects us emotionally. Downcast. Downcast simply says there's a burden, there's a weight, there's something that's weighing my mind down that I can't get past. The unease that our spirit feels in an injustice. I'm not talking about spiritual warfare. We're talking about the social injustices that happens to us. That's a natural phenomenon that is happening right now that affects us as spirit beings. But in our spirit beings is housed our emotions, where our soul, the things that goes on in our soul. While some that have faith and they believe God, but their soul is in trouble and they don't know how to get their soul out of the trouble that their soul is in while they're trying to deal with the injustice. So I don't know if I've answered it or if it's just an observation. I'll just say
Yeah.
it like that.
Yeah. Apostle, do you want to take it, or I can kind of uh, hit on Apostle? Can you hear
I'm
me?
here. I can hear
Oh,
you. I was waiting for you to finish your sentence.
what I will say is that, of course, we know the broad span of injustices, which can be like voter suppression, trying to prohibit people from voting by discouraging them, whether it's long lines, which a lot of people have experienced this year, given the outcome and what people wanted for the presidency. So that's one of the things, or it could be healthcare and that limit. And so, like you stated, it can be different for me than it is for someone else. Maybe someone that has always had access to healthcare versus someone that has not, either due to poverty or the neighborhood that they live in, or if it's socioeconomically. And so that's definitely accurate as far as like my view on a social injustice might be different, or my effects and how I experience it could definitely be different from someone else's. But yeah, I think it also, just like you were talking about being downtrodden, it definitely affects us in so many different ways, just as individuals, because we all experience things and have our own perceptions. And so I didn't want people to know that outside of just the racial side of it, those are other injustices that that others also face. And so those, outside of the race part of it, if we're talking about like voter suppression, or if it's healthcare, if it's poverty, those are forms of trauma, and we'll get into that later. But and how those affect everyone is completely different as well. So I just wanted to let everyone know. But I wanted to say that before Apostle went ahead and said something about it, about the question.
Okay. So it's been a long day. Give me the question again.
So with the whole span of social injustices, and you did answer the question, Dr. Parker, you did answer the question, but with the range of the social injustices, of course we know that it affects us in different ways, but what are some ways in which it can affect us, either if it's mentally, emotionally, spiritually? How does it affect us, and what can we kind of do with that?
Okay. So when it comes down to social injustice, I think one of the things is, because like we just mentioned, there's so many broad things when it comes to injustices. It manifests in so many different forms. And I think a key thing would be to identify how, to identify what triggers you. What is a trigger for you? Because I think sometimes what happens is when we don't recognize that someone else may be triggered, or someone else, may feel very strongly about this, then we have a tendency to become apathetic. And to deal with any type of social injustice on any level, there has to be empathy. You have to be willing to understand it from somebody else's point of view without factoring it through yourself. And I think that is one of the biggest problems that we have in this country, and just around the world, is because people always want to factor things through their experience. And if your experience is not like my experience, I have to be very careful that I don't disqualify your experience because it doesn't match my own and it makes me uncomfortable. A lot of things that require the need to be fixed in social injustice requires us to be uncomfortable. And we are comfort creatures. We do not like things that make us have to pull or push or readjust or challenge our belief system. We don't care for things like that. We are comfortable in what we do and how we do it, and we don't like things to disrupt that comfort. But the truth of it is that these conversations require us to be uncomfortable. There's no way that you can go around that. As far as when it looks like, you're being triggered by something, I think a lot of times we feel like we have to always be on. Like we always, we have to watch every news channel. We have to watch every report. We have to watch everything that comes across our screens because we're trying to be well informed. But it's okay to give yourself a break sometimes, that you don't have to watch that news show right then and there. If you're on your third death for the day, take a breather, because you might not need that next whole gory detail filled thing before 8 o'clock, before you try to go out and help people in the world, or you try to do your job for the day. It's okay to take a breath and be like, okay, I will look at this later. I will decompress before I watch this particular information. Also making sure that you are getting your information from credible sources. A lot of times we are triggered because we are getting information from resources that are not accurate. So we run off of half informed news, or if we don't use the best resources or credible sources to get information from. Like, you shouldn't take information about any type of injustice from a website called PookieMamaNemLine.com. Like, you probably shouldn't watch that news from there, or we totally telling you a whole lot.net. Like, you shouldn't get information from them, because you're going to be frustrated, irritated, and you're going to be half informed. So don't do that to yourself, but allowing yourself to take a step back. It's okay to breathe. It's okay to breathe. It's okay to give yourself space. It's okay to not take in everything that day, and then have people around you that you can decompress with. Have people that you can call and have that conversation with them, and you can talk about solutions, and then figure out how you in your sphere can be a person to bring systemic change. You don't have to have a national platform just to change the sphere around you. Take control of that sphere. Do your best to begin to make little changes in whatever area of social injustice that there is. There's social injustice when it comes to domestic violence. You can be a person who donates to domestic violence shelters. Find some type of way that you can play an intricate role in helping come against those social injustices. You don't have to be able to take on the whole racial injustice piece. Okay, if you look at, and we referred to this in the first episode, and I'll refer to it again. In the civil rights movement, people did what they could where they were at. Everybody wasn't at the March on Washington because everybody couldn't go. Everybody wasn't marching with Dr. King, but they had NAACP chapters that they were a part of, and they did what they could in their town, in their city, in their scope. They did something where everybody band together and they boycotted in their small group to bring about change and to show that change was here. And that the people around them who wanted things to remain the same could no longer ignore the fact that they were raising their hands and saying, we're not going to accept that. Look for ways that you can change things in your sphere so you don't become so overwhelmed by the big picture.
That's good. I was in a group, and they were discussing, I guess, just with different policies not changing, but based on with the policy not changing, with all of the effort of them putting into changing certain things, how apologies from other races are not good enough. And so what would you say with as far as the goal of advocating for social injustices, where there haven't been, you see, we're still fighting for certain things today. And so what is the goal? Like, what can we do as far as maintaining or continuously trying to fight for something that we're still kind of seeking, help from continuously 60 years later or 50 or 40 years later? What do you believe, first, I'll ask it in this way. What do you believe is the goal of advocating for social injustice? And then kind of similar to what you said about the sphere part of it, of what we can do, but how can you maintain that motivation when a lot of changes have not necessarily been made in as far as progression goes? Either way.
Well, I'll say this. I think purpose is attached to it. The purpose of an individual's life. I was much like yourself. I was in a group setting not too long ago, very recently, and several conversations with a diverse group of people. And one of the things, your question was one of the main questions on the table by a Gen Zer, um, that age group 13 to 23. And and then a few of the other Gen Xers, you know, the millennials, all of them. But then it was a group of us adults. And it was one adult that said, when you recognize that your purpose around social, we should all, first of all, we should all have empathy. I use Apostle's word for any social injustice, because that's dealing with our humanity. But to answer your question, at that group setting that I was in, or the Zoom call that I was on, one lady, who's much older even than myself, she says, I am for social, you know, justices. I'm for us getting this thing right. I'm not out there marching. I don't have a picket sign. I have a website, but there's nothing on my website about social injustices. And then somebody chimed in and said, well, what is it that you were called to do in the earth? And is this social injustice? Why isn't that a part of your calling? And so for me, I don't think it's a calling. I think if it is, then everybody should be called to it. You know, but as Apostle said, whatever my little piece that I can do over here to address it and not be silent, I think the key is not being silent, then that's what I'm going to do. My little piece, whether I'm carrying a picket sign, whether I'm out there with a blowhorn, whether I'm writing letters to my congressman, to the Senate, whatever I'm doing, I'm going to be a voice coming out of the church. I'm going to be Jesus himself was all about social justice. When you have a goal to see the hand of God move in the favor of the marginalized and the underprivileged, I don't believe we're going to see all of it until Jesus returns, number one, because it's ongoing, and every generation becomes radical, but they also become weak. So you have to have a balance that's inclusive of purpose. And purpose is key. Whether I'm called to it, I still got to have it somewhere in whatever I'm doing, so that I'm not long in my response.
Oh, you're fine. You're fine. You're fine.
I would just add to that is that you know, I think because we're looking at how long, you know, how long this has been going on, but I really think we have to take a step back and look at some of the things that have been done.
Yeah.
We can't just throw, you know, the baby away with the bathwater. You just can't just throw everything out because it's not to the advancement that you want it to be. And so I think what happens with individuals, they get tired. So then the all or nothing mentality starts to creep in. Everybody's going to have a different way that they're going to view how to get done the things that need to get done when addressing this. But I think being more open to suggestions from both sides, or when I say suggestions from both sides, there are those that believe that, you know, that, let me put it this way. There's this old poem that someone wrote, and it's W.E.B. and Booker T. And it really, I remember reading it as a kid, and that poem talked about the ideologies of Booker T and the ideologies of W.E.B. Du Bois. So in there, they had two different mindsets of how things should be done. Booker T was more come into the fold, do it from the inside out. WB was more outside in. And we still have that going on today when it comes to social injustice. Some people feel like you should fight it from within, and some people feel like you should build your own and do it from without. Just do your own thing, build your own thing, and whatever have you. And both of them have pieces and parts that are correct, but when we start coming against each other and then saying that you're not doing anything, we can't do the infighting if we want to fight the good fight. The infighting needs to stop. There has to be a respect amongst, even older generations and younger generations, because this is the same thing that happened when we look throughout history. The older generation was like, we just do the best we can and we hope it changes. And the younger generation was like, give me a picket sign and I'm boycotting and we burn it down, like whatever they needed to do. This is what they did. And I think it comes when we start to understand the viewpoints of the other party. And then when we begin to say, okay, both can be effective. Both can be effective. You don't tell people just because society is against you, don't go get that college degree. Because how are we ever going to see more African American or brown color faces in corporate America if that's the requirement to get in? Yes, we can build our own. So there should be those that should be building their own. And then there are those who are going to do it from the inside. Respect both parts of the table. We don't have to take one for the other. And when we stop thinking that we have to substitute or we have to disqualify one for the other, then we will be able to see real systemic change. But the whole part about, we're tired because we're not seeing anything. Think about how tired our ancestors were, but they kept showing up. The thing about it is you have to chip at this and chip at this and chip at this. This didn't happen overnight.
Right.
Social injustices, racial discrimination, any type of discrimination did not happen overnight. So the process to tear it down is going to take people being consistent. Consistency is key. We don't get to bow out and pack our bags and go take our balls and go home because it's getting rough. You stay in the game. And you keep playing it until the rules change. And you keep doing things little by little to change the rules. You keep using your voice. You keep using your platform. You keep tearing at your sphere until you make a change. But each one of us can be the driving force for change to happen. But we don't get to go home because it's rough. That's just my 2 cents. Keep going.
That's good. Something you mentioned, so someone did actually ask a question. I want to kind of do some collaboration with those that are also watching. And they said something that you mentioned, which was about just the duration of time, how it didn't happen overnight, so it's not going to go away overnight. We see it systemically as well. And so they want to know, when we look at the African American race, with us going through it for over 400 years, and no other race has had it as tough as this, going all the way back. But do you have any ideas as to why we have suffered for so long as a race? From health to police brutality, racism, abuse, no health care to no care. So either one of you can answer. And I can repeat the question if it wasn't clear.
So, okay. So I get what the person is saying as it relates to the 400 years. I do think we do have to be a little bit broader in some of the racial discriminations that have happened with other races, because I can walk you through Jewish history and we can walk you through Native American history, and you will see many of the same things and things that at least with the Native Americans, where there's still underrepresented, still mistreated, and different things like that. And so I'm saying that to say I don't want us to think that we are a host unto ourselves, because when we start to isolate like that, it uh, it takes us where we will start to be like it's just only us, and it wasn't only us. Now, don't get me wrong, this is ridiculous. The amount that we receive. I by no means am saying that this is a walk in the park and we should high five Native Americans and fist bump Jewish people. But what I am saying is that we want to make sure that we don't start to feel like we are just an entity unto ourselves. There are more historically there are other races who have endured things as well. And so um, what we can start to do is, I'm gonna be honest, and because I think sometimes we be waiting for a magic answer. I have no clue as to why we are so targeted, and it seems like we have consistently been targeted. Other than some group just decided that they want to make us the underdog, and they want to lord over us. But it doesn't make it right. It doesn't make it fair. But the thing of it is, it's like we said, we when we consistently go against what they are saying about us, uh, some things that I will say that for us, even changing the way we represent ourselves, um, just the way we represent ourselves, period. Changing those ideologies that people have about us, changing, um, just doing our best to represent our nationality well, our race well. Looking for ways like that. But it can be difficult. It does feel like we're targeted, but that does not mean that we are the only ones. I'm not sure if I really answered that person's question, but yeah.
Just to piggyback off of Apostle, our American history, as well as if even if you were to go back and look at women in American history, when you talk about racism and discrimination, social injustices, even to this day, you have third world country where young girls are constantly being discriminated against and their bodies are being abused. You have the female genitalia that still goes on. Um, um, and my point is this: when you start to, as Apostle said, become your own host, then you can also become racist against someone, another ethnicity, another nationality. The Jews, for as long as I can remember my American history and go back into biblical history, has always been discriminated against and called all kinds of names. Um, the Native Americans, Indians, they, along with the Jews, Asians, along with Jews and Native Americans. Um, it's a variety um, of diverse people, and not all are marginalized, but some are. Even if we take it to a whole nother dimension of thinking around why does it feel like we are so targeted? Um, and I think for the person who's asking the question, um, some things that are not seen doesn't mean they're not happening. It just seems as though what is happening to a lot of African Americans is more visible. It is a manifestation, and possibly because I don't have the answer either. I'll be honest with you. This is just all based on theory and research that I've done. Um, it possibly, this is just a possibility, that when a person makes up their mind that I'm gonna be something regardless of the color of my skin, I'm gonna do all I can to be in the corporate sector, whatever sector you want to call, you become a target. You automatically become a target, regardless to the color of your skin. But if you are a few shades lighter, if you're not African American, if you're European, then, oh, why are you here? What do you want? What are you doing? Um, because there is a mentality of of we and I want to be careful because I don't want to offend anybody. The whole "Make America Great Again" has nothing to do with making America great when a race becomes or starts to look like the minority. And that's part of the issue, that when you've always been the majority, and now that our world is not looking like what it was, and you are afraid that you are becoming a minority, then you're going to come out with all four barrels loaded. And without me saying any more, I hope the mature people can handle that.
Mhm.
Definitely, definitely.
Right.
So I do want to pivot just a little bit, Dr. Parker. You mentioned something about women and the experiences that they have, not only in this country but then also in other countries as well. I know that you do work with women, and one of your passions as far as um, tearing down the barriers when it comes to breaking down those glass ceilings for women, whether it's in leadership or just women in general who are seeking to have a voice in whether it's male dominated or not, or seeking equality, whether it's income or if it's just simply being in the room. And so I kind of want to shift and pivot to that and talk about, I guess, how you came to that passion and how you saw that void as being important.
Can you ask it one more time because the mic started to do something?
Okay.
I'm sorry.
Hopefully you caught the part of the
I did.
explanation.
I just
But
didn't catch the question.
okay.
Everything else
Yeah.
except the question.
How did you get to that passion as far as for women seeking or needing that voice in those areas? And what was the other part I said? Oh, and seeing the void that it was actually needed for you travel and all of those things. So yeah.
Okay, very quickly, because this right here I can talk on for a good little while. To be very transparent, because I don't know who's in our audience, but there are times when I don't really mind being transparent. When I lost my voice, and what I mean by that, the power of who I am in the kingdom of God and who I am in the earth as a woman that has value, intellect, self-worth. When I lost that at a season of my life, I went back to school. In fact, I took a sabbatical. And because there was something in me that I didn't have to fight, I couldn't figure out what I was fighting or who I was fighting or what was even fighting me. Later, I found out what was fighting me, but up during that season of my life. And so I went back to school, and I believe it was God ordained. I'll hold to that until Jesus comes. I went back to school and got my master's in pastoral counseling, family counseling, and spiritual formation. And so I took a sabbatical. I took a 3-year sabbatical. I still preached, but I got away from everything and everybody that I felt was putting some bondages and putting me in shackles. When you're in a rural town, and people don't know you, uh, um, they will, not them, but the principality that rules the region will cause the spirit of oppression and suppression that makes your voice weak. And when you're new and you're trying to do what's right and you're trying to appease everybody because you want to make friends and you want people to like you, and your family is not here and nobody here, your family is nowhere around. And so I went to school, and my first day in school, I was late because I was nervous. I went, yeah, I had to have classroom. I needed to be with people. And so, and I needed to be with people that weren't like me. Um, and my first day, I walked in class, I was late, and I had to open up my laptop. The professor had already started his lecture and introduction. And when I sat down and he said to me, who are you? And I didn't know what he was really asking. I said, my name is Wanda Parker. He said, no, who are you? And I didn't know what to say. I'm a student enrolled here at Columbia University, Columbia International University. Here are my papers, blah, blah, blah. And he says, I have a prophetic word for you. And to this day, he is still my advisor. He's a Caucasian believer, walks heavy in the prophetic. And he says, God has ordained your steps. It is meant for you to be here to find who you really are. And when you find who you really are, you will find your voice. We had never met. He didn't know anything about me. And tears started to flow. And he says, I could not say prophetic word. He says, I had to say, I have a word for you. Because unbeknown to me, he had been written up by the school on several occasions because he kept walking in his prophetic anointing whenever it hit him in a classroom setting. Well, now in this classroom are a bunch of white people, a bunch of evangelicals at that, and very few blacks. You know, there were one, two, three, four, five, six. I remember six as as my classmates. And so one lady just started hollering, I'm gonna take that word for me. I said, oh, no, 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 that's for me, that's for me. He called me out, not you. But that's when I started to discover um, my voice again. That's when the Lord had me to be in that space, because I couldn't understand why women weren't accepted in the church that I grew up in. And Brittany, of course, has grown up in this church. They promoted women in ministry and everything else outside of the church. I'm like, well, what's the problem? You know, why is there such a problem with women in leadership? I mean, they're in leadership everywhere. They're engineers, they're firefighters, they're law enforcement, they're in politics. What is the problem? And then I didn't have a tolerance for women who were petty. I didn't have a tolerance for women who couldn't take nothing. I just didn't have a tolerance. And I'm like, what is wrong with me? Something is wrong. Something is wrong with me. You know, do I have too much testosterone in my system? What is wrong with me? But it was because I was blindsided and looking one sided and had to open up myself for what other women were experiencing. And out of that, it opened up the whole passion for the void that I even had to embrace and minister to women that are in diverse settings. And I didn't know that's how God was setting up my life, that He was going to put me in diverse settings with diverse women from all kinds of backgrounds. And so that developed, it filled the void, it caused the passion, and I could open up. And then I went on to do my doctoral work. And this was really, really, really major because it was only two Black females in my cohort. And we are at a prominent top 10 influential evangelical school. I didn't know. I just wanted to go to school. until my mentor told me, you're in one of the top 10 affluent schools. A white gentleman walked past the room when we were on break. And he said, so what are you all doing? And nobody said anything. He says, are you all like studying for the ministry of helps? What are you all doing? So one of my mouth cohorts, and I'm glad it was Susan. Susan, she and I, we stay in touch. She's in Nashville. Susan opens her mouth, and she's very philosophical, a theologian in her own right, and she's a Caucasian woman. She's also part Italian, so her Italian blood rose up in her and said, "We're doing the same thing you're doing. We're getting a doctorate degree in ministry." And he says, "Oh, they allow women to do that?" This was just in 2014. And she says, "Have you been under a rock? What is your name? Where are you from?" And we had to shut her down because all of us are getting ready to get put out of school. We said, "Susan, you got to shut that down." He says, "No, serious. I would really like to have lunch with all of you all and find out what you're doing here." Well, my academic advisor and my professor says, "We welcome that. And bring your buddies with you." And that day was such a revolutionizing day for them to know that women were called to this work and called to leadership and called in other areas and vectors of life. And we just couldn't figure out, when I kept seeing women go get coffee and bring donuts, and I'm going, what? I'm looking one side. So that's how I developed the passion to help women gain and regain their voice and to know their place. And they have a place in the room, but you also got to know what to do when you're in the room. And you got to have something to say when you're in the room.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, I think as we've seen the rise of women's rights from what you've just explained, especially in ministry and leadership and having their voice and pretty much making way for women and women's rights in all areas and dimensions to that. So it's definitely something that's needed, and being able to provide that voice and provide that space as well. So I'm going to also ask Apostle a question, both pertaining, of course, to you both expertise. And so, Apostle, I know that you deal with mental and behavioral health. And so we are going to kind of talk about if you can explain, because we know I've had a discussion with you before about how poverty has been in a way, an injustice, but then how also it's a very powerful quote that you stated, and I have it here, so I'm going to read it. Hopefully you can expound on it as well, but you state how poverty was a form of trauma. Mm-hmm. And you said being able to exist not only within our trauma, but as humans. And so in that regard, can you explain first, I'm hoping that people know what poverty is, but if you can explain that, and then how poverty is trauma, and then also anything else you want to add to that as far as
Because I think I said that quote under the unction of Holy Spirit, and I still am like, I don't know where I was that day. So you keep asking me that, and I'm like,
I'm hoping you remember, because I'm like, please explain.
So, but one thing I will say is usually in any seminars or trainings that I do, when I get to the part about being human, the capacity about being human. Being human is the ability to hold your heart open to others when you don't know their motives or intentions. That's the definition of what being a human is. Jesus is the perfect example of a true human being. So when people say, "Oh, I'm just being human," it's like, but there's so much trauma wrapped around your being human. You're not holding your heart open to others when you don't know their motive and intent. And when you talk about trauma, trauma is a response to a negative event. So you're going to be closed off. You're going to be shut down on various things, because whatever that negative experience was, the trauma is the reaction. Because remember, we always say that trauma is the event. Trauma is not the event. It's the reaction to the negative event. This is why two people can go through the exact same thing and not come out the same, because it's all about the coping skills that you have to get through that. And so when you're talking about poverty-based situations, what are some of the resources that people do have available? Because some people can go through, like, say, for instance, my family and I, and then other people who lived in a projects when I was younger. So we all lived in a poverty-based environment. Based upon our family's income. So we stayed in Cleveland projects. So, but the support system that we had within our family amongst ourselves versus the support system that some of my friends had in place, you know what I mean? It was different. Their households were different. So this is why when we get to poverty, I think one of the mistakes that we make is we try to group everybody together. And so then this is where we get into social injustices later on, because we develop this, well, I pulled myself up by my bootstraps. You should pull yourself up by your bootstraps as well. No, I may not have had the same coping mechanism, same support system that you have had. And so this can lead to re-traumatization and poverty. So a lot of poverty that we see is very cyclic. You have families where generations have been attached to the welfare system because nobody has really been able to figure out a way to break that cycle. So we see poverty. We see poverty in just with people living in certain neighborhoods. So then there's a discrimination that goes on with individuals that are in that neighborhood. So they don't have access to certain things that we have if you live in suburbia. You know what I mean? So case in point, speaking from experience of growing up in poverty versus where my son grew up, so his dad and I, fought to get out of that cycle from both sides of our family. So my son knows nothing about, quote unquote, growing up in the hood. So, and when I say that like that, it's just because he's like, I've never experienced this because we always lived in the suburbs. But poverty to us, there was a lack of grocery stores. So we didn't have access to the best produce. We didn't have access to the freshest meat, because of limitation where people not being able to afford vehicles. They were limited on going to the store and being able, you know what I mean? If you could catch a ride to a better neighborhood, you have more things available to you. So all of this starts a cycle in which this becomes traumatic because you become so enmeshed in the blocks that are around you. If anybody's ever lived in Cleveland and is familiar with the 105 area. Now, 105 is like one street, like it's one part St. Clair, one part Superior, but 105 is considered to be all those streets, all those blocks in between 105. Right. And it's like, wait, that's not even that's Adams. You know what I mean? That's North Boulevard. They're like, this is 105. But it just goes to show you that the nature of that area is so poverty stricken that it all ties in together. The people start to develop a groupthink mentality, in which everybody starts to think the same. You're seen as weird or different if you aspire to really want to do some other things. There's not a lot of opportunities. There's not a lot of opportunities to work within your neighborhood. You have to go outside of your neighborhood. So to have access to things, you have to leave the neighborhood because there was nothing really there. So when we look at poverty within these communities, it is a huge form of trauma because you're limited. There are a lot of negative events that surround living in those neighborhoods that you start to become accustomed to. I will be very honest, it leads a lot of people to what's called survival brain. And it doesn't really put you in the mode for learning brain. And so when people are in survival brain, they are just trying to make it through the day. They're trying to make it through the moment. It's not a lot of future thought process. You know what I mean? So if you do have somebody around you that is saying you can be anything that you want to be, it's great to say those terms in poverty-filled neighborhoods. It's great to say you can be anything that you want to be, but at some point we have to provide the resources for them to be anything that they want to be, because that's the only way you're going to break that poverty traumatic cycle. Does that help?
Yeah, definitely. So I'm going to ask you both this question. We're going to be coming to a close pretty soon, but I need to ask at least 2 more questions, and then we're gonna end it. But before, I know we talked about just different examples that we may have seen in scripture as far as where we've seen the different injustices. If you both can explain or at least give an example of a social injustice that has been exemplary in scripture, and what can we take from those examples? So either one of you.
I defer to Apostle.
And you don't have to give me like the chapter, the book.
That's the first
Okay, because I'm like, girl, Lord have mercy. I think if you just open up the 66 books, you just see it all. You see it all through the entire. There's various times where Israel was suppressed, or oppressed by whatever various ruler that they were in. I think the one that really, really always catches my attention, because like I said, I'm a history buff, is always when the Roman Empire enters into the scene. And when the Roman Empire enters into the scene, man, when you have to study further than just what is listed in the Bible and really understand the amount of oppression. I mean, you're talking about like Nero taking them and dipping them in tar and then stringing them up and setting them on fire to light his garden, setting the city on fire and then saying, oh, the Christians did it so they could be persecuted, watching them being persecuted by individuals throughout history during the Black Plague. Why? Because they didn't get sick, because they followed the biblical truths of how to keep themselves clean, like washing their hands and using fresh water. But this actually made them a target because their lifestyle was different. And so it really puts into perspective some of the social injustices just when you live a life that's different than the status quo. Christians living the lifestyle and following Christ, who was seen as this upstart and this usurper of Roman authority. He was telling them, yeah, you live within this empire, but this empire doesn't control you. And so when I study that out, it inspires me to be the Christian that I am supposed to be in the midst of this world that we live in. That no matter what social injustices are out here, I serve the God of true justice. And so that gives me hope that if I continue to do what I'm supposed to do, then justice will come. So that is one of the things is just really looking at that, and you see so many different, because for some of them it was the, oh, you're Jewish, and because they were Jewish, here's a whole discrimination package for you because you are part of this nationality. And it was the same thing when they became Christians. And then the Christians had to deal with the Jewish people looking down on them, as well as the Roman Empire. You know, if you fast forward and you look at the whole issue with the Holocaust, just because of the nationality, just because somebody had trauma from their daddy, Hitler had trauma from his daddy, and he tried to take out a whole nation because of some unresolved trauma that he had as a kid. He decides to just try to wipe out an entire population of people and commit genocide just because of that. So we see these things. We've seen where the church has come through some of those darkest times. And like I said in yesterday's video that I did, where it's been darkest in the world, the church has shined brightest.
Mm-hmm.
So,
you know, I'll say this, and Apostle, I'm enjoying you. Especially when you start talking about the Roman Empire and the Roman emperors. I remember our trip to Rome, and we went twice just because it's you go, and this is where y'all start killing and blaming the Christians for it. You all took out a whole nation, you burned people up, but I'm gonna just take a very short spin on this, Apostle and Brittany, and that is when history changed in the Old Testament for women. When the daughters of Zelophehad said, "Oh, because we are girls, we don't get an inheritance." Oh, because we don't have, there's not a man to carry on the name of our father. We don't get an inheritance. Well, that's that. Now listen, when you talk about discrimination in terms of genderism and sexism, that those girls had to be brave in that environment. That environment was treacherous. They weren't allowed to even be where they were, and while they showed up at the door of the tabernacle, that had to be God ordained to break that barrier. That because he didn't have any sons, these girls can't have an inheritance. Okay, Moses, go talk to God on our behalf, and I promise you, God gonna come back with something in our favor. And I say that juxtaposed against, we have an African American female going into the White House as a VP. Something has to be said about that, in this whole barrier, breaking down walls and barriers for women in leadership, for women in ministry, for women doing anything. That is a lot to be said about that. Historically, we are still making history, and I will always hold fast to that. That's one of my favorite Old Testament stories as it pertains to women, and God favoring us. I will always say this wherever I go: God always looks out for his girls. He looks out for us, all of us.
in Jewish culture, they are actually known as the women who changed God's mind.
Yeah.
That's what they're known for. And if you study them even further, when they're mentioned again in scripture, you will find that they actually preserve their tribe's inheritance.
That's
because they were like, hey, they have this whole inheritance that they got from their father. And if they marry outside the tribe, that money, that wealth,
right.
all of that goes with the new tribe. And that will significantly damage the tribe that they were in. And so, they made a commitment to marry within the tribe to make sure that it stayed, it stayed in there. So not only did they change God's mind, they actually brought economic wealth to their entire tribe. So tell me, women can't This is why I have a problem
We
with
know how to we know how to
right.
we
That's what I say.
understand.
Female apostles don't have to keep running around trying to prove that you're an apostle. You don't have to keep trying to prove that you're
Right.
called to, just
Yeah.
whatever your title is. Just
Yeah.
do the work.
Right. And it will speak for itself. It will speak. Those girls, who they are, my girls. My girls.
Awesome. I really enjoyed you all. I have one last question. It's literally just one thing that you have to say.
Okay.
If someone comes to you and they ask you, well, how can I make a change or make my voice heard, or what action can I take as far as a social injustice is concerned? What is the one thing you would tell them? Now, it can be, I don't want to answer for y'all, but it can be maybe using your voice or going out and marching. So those are just examples. But what is one thing that you would tell them to do to take further action? We can marinate if you'd like.
I would say the first thing that I would tell somebody, and it's kind of going to be twofold for me, educate and heal. Educate and heal. I said this yesterday. Do not start spouting stuff off of your platform and your voice is not healed.
Mm-hmm.
Don't do us a favor. Do us a favor. We got enough problems. Heal before you try to be heard. Okay? Do your best to heal before you try to be heard. But also educate yourself on the issue. If when you start, and Prophetess Brittany, because you had your revelation last night when you texted me, and I was falling asleep, and I was like, let me wake up with one eye and be like, yay, and celebrate you, because you had your revelation of what the social injustice passion had been ignited for you, and that sphere that you're going to do it in. And that's perfectly fine. You have to find what ignites that passion on the inside of you. For me, it is working with mental health and developmental disability. I will always advocate for mental health in the church. I can teach you how to prophesy. I can teach you how to interpret dreams, but we are going to get some therapy. Like it's a no. A no-brainer for me. You have to be healed. So educate yourself on the issues. And when you find that thing that sparks something on the inside of you, pray and ask God if that's your realm, if that's your sphere of influence, because that's what we should have, a sphere of influence. So ask God what your sphere of influence is, educate yourself, and then make sure your voice is healed enough that you can operate in that realm of influence well. You become a master at what you do. Master your sphere by mastering your healed voice.
That's good.
Yeah, Apostle took the key one for me, and that is education. Educate yourself. Knowledge is power. Knowledge is power. And the second one, that if I had to do a second one, it would be who's your audience? You got to know your audience. Who are you targeting? Your sphere of influence, so that you can add value and make an impact wherever your sphere of influence is, by knowing your audience and having knowledge.
Awesome. All right. Well, we are coming to a close with this discussion for part 2, talking about mental health and social injustice in and outside of the church as well. And so I really appreciate my guests for being on for part 2, and looking forward to, of course, collaborating once again sometime in the near future. And I thank all of our viewers for watching, and hopefully you all will be able to tune in for the month of January as we talk about recidivism and mental illness. And that's probably, as Apostle stated, that's something that I'm really passionate about as well. So I thank you all so much, and you are more than welcome to share this video to whomever. And it is definitely open to the public, and use it as a conversation starter. because it needs to be talked about. So thank you all so much. I appreciate you all, and I will see you all next time.
Thank you for having us. Good to
Thank
see
you.
you, Paula.
Thank you.
Good to see you too, Dr. Parker.
Thank you all for joining us online. Blessings.
Thank you.